could once again become Speaker because of the terrible pitfalls this IRS mess will have for your 2014 candidates?
Well, the second question is almost irrelevant, with all due respect. It isn't about...
All of that online at cspan.org. The U.S. House gaveling in next, and for the third time since its passage in 2010, they will take up a full repeal of the 2010 health care law. Live coverage on C-SPAN.
It will be offered by a guest chaplain, Dr. Mike Landry, the Sarasota Baptist Church, Sarasota, Florida.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I approach your throne on behalf of a nation that desperately needs you. We are faced with much division and disunity in our land, and we request your healing and reconciling touch. We thank you that you are not a spectator God who sits in heaven unconcerned and uncaring. We acknowledge that the greatness of our nation is due to your blessing and provision, and we know that you have blessed us in order that we might be a blessing to other nations. We understand that to whomever much is given, much will be required. Father, grant these legislative leaders wisdom and courage to make decisions today that honor you. May your will be done on earth just as it is in heaven. And finally, Father, pour out your grace and protect the marriages and families of these, our nation's leaders. I offer this prayer in the strong name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. The Chair has examined the Journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the Journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal.
Questions on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal? Those in favor indicate by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The Speaker's Journal is approved.
Mr. Speaker,
gentleman from Illinois.
I demand the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing. Sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Pledge allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
I ask members, staff, and friends in the gallery to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege this morning to welcome a very good friend to the halls of Congress. Pastor Mike Landry, who delivered the opening prayer this morning, is a great spiritual leader in Sarasota, Florida. For the past 16 years, he has served as senior pastor to Sarasota Baptist Church, located in the heart of my district. My wife, Sandy, and I have had the pleasure of knowing the pastor for nearly 5 years. He's very devoted to his family, his church, his congregation, and serving the people of Southwest Florida. He has made himself an incredible and beloved member of our community. I commend Pastor Landry for his outstanding service to our community and to our nation. It's my honor today to welcome him here to the House of Representatives, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The Chair will entertain 15 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For purposes, the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address an important issue, the attack against America and its citizens by terrorists in Benghazi. 4 Americans, including our ambassador, Chris Stevens, have been killed. The American people deserve the truth about Benghazi and who was responsible. Not convenient stories blaming the violence on some filmmakers' free speech rights. The people who died deserve justice. As we investigate this attack and those responsible, as we investigate this attack and the response of the civilians and military leaders in command, we must determine whether the paralysis that seem to characterize the government's reaction was a result of individual bad decisions or a broader institutional problem. Our military and our soldiers are the most capable in the world, but if their commanders refuse to send them into battle, they cannot safeguard American lives or interests. The American people and our allies abroad need to know the United States has the resolve to act in the face of uncertainty. Our enemies need to know that when they attack Americans, they do so at great danger because Americans do not leave our people behind.
Time's
I yield
expired.
back.
For purposes, the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the Holocaust Education and Resource Center of Rhode Island, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this weekend. I had the honor of serving on their board for a number of years. This wonderful institution was first founded by Holocaust survivors living in Rhode Island during the 1980s. It formally opened its doors on May 5, 1988, and since that time it's helped to provide Rhode Islanders with educational resources on the Holocaust and commemorates the lives of the millions of victims of this horrific atrocity. In addition, the Holocaust Education and Resource Center works with schools in Rhode Island, southeastern Massachusetts, and even the suburbs of Boston to teach young people about the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity and to work to eradicate bigotry and intolerance. Congratulations to the Holocaust Education and Resource Center on 25 successful years of promoting tolerance and respect to tens of thousands of Rhode Islanders, for helping us all remember those killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust, and for making Rhode Island and our world a better place. I wish this organization continued success in the years to come, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes, the gentleman from Texas seek recognition.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, Fort Bend Christian Academy rules. Yesterday, the Eagles won 2 state titles. They started with the Lady Eagles winning their 4th state championship in softball, the 4th title in 7 years. Behind Coach Ferguson Carroll and Elizabeth Fox's 12 strikeouts, the Lady Eagles crushed Fort Worth Christian 4-0. Right after that game ended, the Fort Bend Christian men won their first state baseball title with a close 12-11 victory over Midland Christian. Coach Roman and the team never quit, scoring 4 runs in the top of the 6th inning to take the lead for good. There's an old saying in naval aviation: don't mess with an eagle unless you know how to fly. Fort Bend Christian men and women know how to fly. They are Eagles, and they are Texas state champs. I proudly yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes, the gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our farms and ranches produce food products in amounts that greatly exceed our nutritional needs. There is no reason for anyone in this country to go hungry. And yet, there is a daily reality faced by many poor families. The food stamp program provides a small but essential safety net to meet the nutritional needs of children, the elderly, the disabled, and those who fall on hard times when our economy sheds jobs. The proposed cuts to the food stamp program included in the House Farm Bill are unacceptable and cruel. Poor nutrition leads to poor health outcomes and long-term developmental problems in children. It does not save money. It simply transfers costs to those who cannot pay those costs and needlessly increases suffering. We can't afford to feed all of our citizens. A farm and food policy that cannot deliver nutritious meals to all Americans is indeed failed policy. We can and must do better. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the President made a pledge to Americans. If you elect me and you like your current health care, you'll be able to keep it. The reality today is that nearly 7 million people are set to lose their employer-sponsored health insurance when the President's health care law goes into full effect. On January 1st, many Americans will be forced into an exchange program that has not even been set up. Nancy Pelosi promised the American people, Congress must pass the bill so you can find out what's in it. The Democratic-controlled House passed the bill almost 4 years ago. They didn't know what was in the bill then, and they don't know what to do now. We're less than 7 months away from many Americans being forced into exchanges, yet they don't know what options are available to them. What we do know is that consumers are already looking at sharp premium increases. The very people who were promised the most, those young people under the age of 29, are expected to get increases somewhere in the range of 200%. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Most Americans operate under a budget. Americans need to know what the increases in their health care costs will be and what plan options are available. Americans need to know the effects of this legislation will have on their lives, and they need to know now. The administration has had 4 years to figure this out, and the only thing they figured out is that they don't know what to do.
The gentleman's time has expired. For purpose, the gentleman from New York seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Homeland Security Committee adopted my amendment to block a study of new fees for passengers and pedestrians crossing our borders. A similar amendment was successfully included in the Senate legislation last week. The consensus for blocking this tax is welcomed, but not surprising. Cross-border travel is central to the economic viability of border communities, including my own in western New York. Last year, 3 million Canadians visited our region, spending nearly $1 billion. Canadians rely on seamless travel at one of my District's 5 border crossings to travel from the Buffalo-Niagara International Airport, area businesses, and to attend sporting and cultural events. Mr. Speaker, with the bipartisan support, bicameral support for this issue, I suggest that language blocking the border fees should be included in the upcoming immigration reform legislation. This is a senseless tax, it's counterproductive, and we should take every action to prevent it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life and accomplishments of Moses Harrison. His judicial successes have been well chronicled, but he got elected to the Illinois Supreme Court in 1992 and served for 8 years before becoming the Chief Justice. However, there's probably no more credible source than my mom, who says that Moses was a nice, gentle man. Everyone who knew him liked him. I also appreciate his support in a letter for me to go to the military academy at West Point. Moses was very involved in local activities and also was involved in the Episcopal Church. Mr. Harrison was preceded in death by his son Luke. He leaves behind his wife Sharon, his son Judge Clarence Harrison, and his wife and 4 grandchildren who will greatly miss him. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we are in dangerous and uncharted territory. At 400 parts per million, there is now more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than at any time in the past 3 million years. Now, here in the United States, more than a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. So it's urgent that we make our cars and trucks cleaner, but also that we invest in clean modes of transportation such as rail. Saturday was National Train Day, which celebrates the rail networks that efficiently move freight and passengers across our country and reduce the number of cars on our roads. In California, we're building high-speed rail with renewable energy. When complete, it will move millions of people far more quickly, cleanly, and efficiently than we do today. And in the North Bay, we're connecting Sonoma and Marin counties with 70 miles of rail, meaning 1.4 million fewer car trips along Highway 101. Investments in rail at the national scale can increase efficiency, reduce traffic, and fight climate change. It's time for Congress to get all aboard with this climate solution. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute. Advised to extend my
Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this administration's repeated disregard for transparency and the rule of law should trouble every American. Mr. Speaker, the administration has accused congressional Republicans of playing politics as we conduct oversight into the administration's failures before, during, and after the terrorist attack in Benghazi. But this is hypocritical coming from an administration that already altered talking points to cover their own political agenda. And more recently, Mr. Speaker, we learned that the IRS deliberately targeted conservative groups. The IRS has the serious responsibility of collecting taxes and holding accountable those that cheat the system. And now it seems that they themselves are choosing when to follow the law. Mr. Speaker, the American people deserve more from their elected officials. I hope as details of these events emerge, the American people will find out the truth, not just the administration's spin. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for a moment.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to be introducing the Foster Children Opportunity Act today. This legislation will ensure that abused and neglected immigrant children have an opportunity to succeed in our country. It is supported by over 175 child welfare organizations. As we debate immigration reform, it is critical that we consider the needs of immigrant children involved in the child welfare system. This is a population that is especially vulnerable and frequently overlooked. Despite being eligible for special forms of immigration relief, foster children are slipping through the cracks and leaving care without a resolution of their immigration issues. As a result, they cannot work legally in the U.S. and face the threat of deportation back to a country they don't know, one where their abuser may still live. We owe these children better. My bill will make sure immigrant foster youth are assisted with resolving their immigration issues prior to leaving care and guarantees that they have access to programs such as Medicaid that foster youth depend on to make a healthy transition into adulthood. May is National Foster Care Month. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the Foster Children Opportunity Act. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, no single piece of legislation rests so squarely on a foundation of broken promises as the 2010 health care law known as Obamacare. We were told that it would lower insurance rates to the tune of $2,500 per family. But we know it not only is it not lowering rates, it's causing rates to spike 10%, 20%, even 30, 40% in some states. We were told it was going to be cost effective, but now we know that the costs were purposely understated to mask the true cost of this nearly $2 trillion bill. We were told if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. We now know the question is not whether millions of Americans will lose their current plans, but how many millions of Americans will lose their current plans. This is what you get when you pass a 2,000-page bill before reading it. Oh, and do you want the IRS to be involved with your health care? Obamacare is failing and the American people are paying the price for this failure. Let's turn the page on Obamacare and enact true patient-centered reform that benefits people, not bureaucrats. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Pentagon, about 26,000 servicemen and women were subjected to sexual assault while serving in this nation's military this past year. In fact, last year, Congress saw the Lackland Air Force scandal unravel as instructors were accused of engaging in sexual relationships with 32 recruits. Earlier this month, an Air Force lieutenant colonel overseeing the sexual assault prevention programs was arrested for sexual assaulting a woman while he was under the influence of alcohol. 2 days ago, the Pentagon revealed yet another sexual assault allegation against an Army sergeant at Fort Hood who is currently under investigation for multiple charges, including prostitution solicitation charges. Mr. Speaker, We are talking about instructors, about lieutenant colonels, about sergeants, about people who have moved up in the ranks. I believe this highlights the underlying issue of leadership, or the lack of, in military leaders, and we must hold them accountable. And I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time's expired. For purposes, the gentlelady from Kansas seek recognition.
Address the House for 1 minute and revise.
Without objection, the gentlelady from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
The President tells Americans to trust the government, but this week is loaded with reasons not to. Take the new health care law. We were told it would lower cost and increase access. Now we find premiums could increase by 400%, and 7 million who had insurance through their employers will lose it. This law will turn the IRS, caught in a scandal of its own, into chief health care enforcers. And it's proven so unpopular, HHS Secretary Sebelius has resorted to soliciting contributions to promote Obamacare from the same people this law authorizes her to regulate. If I got a call, I'd field pressure to ante up, and in America, this shouldn't happen. Today, I'm proud to support repealing this costly law to keep the IRS out of your health care and to work on replacing it with a patient-focused alternative that will actually help families. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For purposes, the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the deep cuts once again being proposed by Republicans to the SNAP program in the House Farm Bill. In July 2012, the House Agriculture Committee reported a bipartisan farm bill that included $16 billion in food stamp cuts. Guess what? The Speaker and the Republican majority refused to schedule that bill for a vote. And so, the Agriculture Committee has now marked up another farm bill, this time with $20 billion in cuts to the SNAP program. Why are you so determined to attempt deficit reduction on the backs of the poor and less fortunate in our society? The SNAP program helps families that have fallen on hard times and helps them feed their families until they can get back on their feet. I am very upset by these proposed cuts. I ask my Republican colleagues to take a fresh look at what they are proposing and reconsider these cuts, cuts that will affect 2 million poor people, many of whom are children and the elderly. Mr. Speaker, we are a nation that helps the less fortunate. This is not who we are as a country. We are compassionate people, and we should feed the hungry in times of need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House will again vote to address the imprecisely named Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Critics say that we're tilting at windmills. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's review. Within the last month or so, we've heard from the senator who authored the law to refer to it as a coming train wreck. That's right. He called it a train wreck. We've heard from the administration official responsible for helping set up the insurance exchanges worry that the public might be in for a third world experience as they try to find health care. Oh, and let us not forget some of the very same members of Congress who voted to foist this massive overreach on Americans are now feverishly trying to find ways to exempt themselves and their staff from its effects. Let's look at the checklist, shall we? Premiums shooting up, check. Small businesses hiring fewer workers and jobs being lost, check. Employees seeing their hours cut, check. Faulty cost projections, check. Everything that opponents of this law listed as a reason to vote against this example of government overreach is actually occurring and happening. Tilting at windmills, Mr. Speaker? Hardly. Working to protect the American people from a horribly disruptive and ineffective law? Certainly. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Alabama seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to be removed as a co-sponsor of H.R. 1550. I rise today in support of struggling families, low-income women, and children across this nation and oppose the dangerously high cuts in the Farm Bill to SNAP program. The current House version of the 2013 Farm Bill will have devastating effects on so many working families, especially in Alabama. It threatens over 900,000 participants in my home state of Alabama alone. These proposed cuts are unacceptable. While I understand that our nation faces a serious debt and deficit problem, we also face fragile economic recovery, and families and children depend upon these government assistance programs, especially the children in the state of Alabama. I think that we are encroaching upon a dangerous trend of cuts on the backs of the people who can least afford to have those cuts. Now is not the time to turn our backs on these struggling American families. We must work together and take action to protect all Americans who depend upon these vital programs.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Without objection, the gentlelady's request is granted. For purpose, the gentleman from Florida seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is unacceptable that our nation's tax collectors have targeted organizations based solely on their political beliefs. Our nation's strength depends on its citizens' freedom to organize and participate in the political process, and no branch of government should be used to harass and unfairly judge the American people. The IRS's actions are not only troubling, but are also further erode America's people's trust in public institutions, that they may act impartially. It's unacceptable. This matter needs to be actively investigated, and those guilty of improper action should be appropriately punished. We cannot allow differences of political opinion to erode our nation's best traditions and the rule of law. Americans cannot and will not accept judgment based upon their political beliefs. We must prevent this discrimination from ever happening again. And I yield back, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If there's one thing this entire Congress, this entire country can agree on, is the need to stand with our veterans. As a nation, we're truly humbled by our servicemen and women. They make incredible and, in some instances, unimaginable sacrifices to protect our country. And that feeling comes with an understanding that we have an obligation to provide our veterans with the benefits they've earned. Among the most critical of these benefits are access to educational opportunities and workforce training. To make sure that the current programs are working, our veterans need a voice at the VA. For that reason, I am honored to introduce the Veterans Advisory Committee on Education Improvement Act. This bipartisan legislation extends the Veterans Advisory Committee on Education through 2015 and includes veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. The committee advises the VA on how to improve educational and job training programs. I thank my colleague and friend, Mr. Renacci, for co-sponsoring this bill, and I look forward to working towards its passage. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House out of order for 1 moment.
Without objection, the gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The sad tale of Benghazi is a story of complacency, incompetence, and cover-up. Complacency in the face of repeated warnings by the CIA and diplomats on the ground that the post was in danger. Incompetence in preparing for a potential attack in a region in turmoil, in a place where we had multiple military assets, and on a day where we had every reason to believe trouble would occur. And an attempted cover-up of a successful terrorist attack with talk about videos and spontaneous riots when the State Department, the CIA, and top officials in the administration knew the truth. Mr. Speaker, it's time for the administration to take responsibility, come clean, and dismiss those associated with this debacle that cost the lives of 4 brave Americans. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to revise my remarks for 1 minute to address the House.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today during Asian Pacific Heritage Month to celebrate the life and achievements of Congressman Dalip Singh Sand. Congressman Sand was the first Asian American member of Congress, the very first member of a non-Abrahamic faith and the first member born in Asia. He was also our first Sikh American to enter Congress. He also represented my hometown of Riverside, California, a community that I proudly represent today. Having come to California from India to pursue his education, Sand graduated with a master's and PhD in mathematics from the University of California, Berkeley. Following his graduation, Sand worked as a farmer, but was also a local activist. He spent years pushing to end naturalization restrictions for Indians living in the United States. In 1950, Sand made a bold decision and entered local government. In 1955, Sand decided to run for an open seat in Congress and won. Representing the Inland Empire from 1956 to 1963, Congressman Sand served on the Foreign Affairs and Interior Committees. Unfortunately, his promising career as a member of this distinguished body came to an abrupt end when he suffered a severe stroke in May 1962. Congressman Sand truly lived the American dream, an immigrant who came to America with dreams and aspirations of making a difference for himself and for future generations. As the current representative, I honor his legacy and impact on all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IRS admitted to targeting conservative groups with extra scrutiny, demanding donor lists, meeting minutes, personal member information, even Facebook activity. The Justice Department was caught essentially spying on the Associated Press, and the White House continues to twist itself in knots, explaining why it misled the American public in the aftermath of Benghazi. The administration's apologists are in a panic. They claim the President is not responsible for any of this wrongdoing. The President, who made a career touting government as the solution to most every problem, now solicits our understanding. It seems the Leviathan is rather unwieldy and difficult to manage. This is my shocked face. These scandals are byproducts of government too big for its britches and proof that the IRS should not be given more power to manage our health care. House Republicans are committed to a smarter, accountable government that works for the people and safeguards liberty against tyranny and bureaucratic incompetence. That starts with repealing Obamacare.
The gentlelady's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to voice my opposition to the proposed $20 billion in cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Program, also known as the SNAP program. This program currently provides food assistance to 47 million Americans who otherwise would not have access to one of the most basic human necessities, food. 2 million low-income Americans, most of whom are working families with children, senior citizens, and people with disabilities, will lose their food assistance as a result of these cuts. Of that number, 200,000 children would also lose access to their free school meals because their eligibility for these meals are tied to their receipt of SNAP. Let me ask my Republican colleagues, how often do your children have to learn on empty stomachs or come home and study on empty stomachs? I dare say not often, if ever. But that is what the Republicans are proposing that we do to close a quarter of a million children. They are asking them not only to learn on empty stomachs, but also to come home and study on empty stomachs. This cannot stand. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this month the United States Bureau of Land Management indefinitely canceled all oil and natural gas leases in California. This includes 1,278 acres of prime oil and natural gas land in Kern and Fresno counties located in my district, California 21. This land is part of the Monterey Shale Formation located in the Central Valley. the Monterey Shale contains 2/3 of our country's shale oil reserves, the equivalent of 15.4 billion barrels of oil. If tapped, I could generate 500,000 jobs and generate $4.5 million in revenue. This would have a significant impact on my district, which has faced chronic unemployment for years. However, citing sequestration, BLM is suspending all future lease sales in California. This decision was made despite the fact that these leases provide significant revenue for the federal government. This is just another example of the administration using sequestration to further their environmental policy agenda at the expense of American families. BLM's efforts to prevent energy development are depriving my constituents of quality jobs and increasing energy prices for hardworking families across the country. It is unacceptable that BLM is halting lease auctions in regions.
The gentleman's time's expired.
I yield back the rest of my time.
For purposes of the gentlelady from New York, seek recognition. Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
As I watch the farm bills move forward in the House and Senate, I'm very saddened at the disregard for my most vulnerable constituents, our fellow Americans. Cutting another of our nation's safety nets will only serve to further the suffering of disadvantaged children and senior citizens across the country. Many of the recipients in my district who rely on SNAP to lift their families out of poverty and combat what would otherwise be certain malnutrition of their children, for many of these families, this is the only form of income assistance they receive. 80% of them fall below the poverty line. Reducing benefits would have a terrible effect on millions of Americans. In addition to Recovery Act's boost of funds ending, further cuts are not warranted. Although the recipients of SNAP don't have an association to represent them here in Washington, I have come to the floor today to let them know that they are not being forgotten in this fight and that many representatives will continue to battle on their behalf. Thank you. Are you back from time?
The gentlelady's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is becoming clearer by the day that Obamacare is detrimental to all Americans. The unaffordable Lack of Care Act will cost almost $2 trillion, raise taxes by $1.1 trillion, and cut Medicare by $716 billion. Despite the President's statement that premiums will decrease by $2,500 under Obamacare, the average family premium has grown over $3,000 and climbing. Over 30 studies have concluded that the law will make health care premiums more unaffordable for Americans. Furthermore, young adults could see their premiums increase on average between 145 and 189% next year. Even Democrats are beginning to jump off the Obamacare bandwagon. The architect of the bill recently referred to the law as a train wreck, and HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius stated she did not anticipate how complicated it would be to implement the bill. In light of the recent news that the IRS was deliberately targeting Americans, can we really trust them to be in charge of our health care? The bottom line is the President's health care law is a bad one. Our job creators are citing the unknown surrounding it as reasons for planned layoffs and why they cannot expand their businesses. If the Senate really wants to pass a jobs bill, then they should listen to the American people and support repeal and replace. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Hawaii seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a growing epidemic in our military that requires our immediate action. I rise today to highlight a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that will stem the growing cancer of sexual assault on men and women in the military. This is absolutely unacceptable. In every branch of the military, from day one, our service members are instilled with the values of honor, respect, and integrity. It's what makes us proud to wear the uniform, and it's what makes our military strong. However, this epidemic completely undermines what these values in our service members represent. This morning I joined a strong, committed group of legislators to introduce the Military Justice Improvement Act, which provides a uniform and fair process ensuring that sexual predators are exposed and punished accordingly. We in Congress and leaders in the Department of Defense must keep the pressure on. Together we must foster a respectful, productive environment for our military men and women. The success of our armed forces and the security they provide our nation depends on it. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time's expired. For purposes, the gentleman from Texas seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's an article I missed that came out March 15th, 2013 from Healthcare IT News. Rather interesting. It talks about a lawsuit against the IRS because the IRS, it says, stole health records of some 10 million Americans, including the medical records of all California state judges. No, in California, I bet most of them are Democrats. They took their medical records. So the allegation, the lawsuit is over that. 10 million Americans' records. It doesn't matter what party they are. It doesn't matter what their political beliefs are. They have a right to have their own records kept private until Obamacare fully kicks in. I don't know why the IRS would take those medical records so prematurely, because when Obamacare kicks in, the federal government has everybody's records already. It's time to repeal it.
Gentleman's time's expired. For purpose, the gentleman from New York seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today not to offer my own words about the Republicans' major cuts to food stamps. Instead, I want to let my constituents speak directly to the House Republican leadership. In this stack of plates sent to me, one of my constituents asked, how would I live if food stamps were cut? Another said, there are a lot of people who would go hungry without food stamps. If the help I receive now for food stamps was cut, it would affect me and my kids while I'm trying to finish my college degree. In these hard times, food pantries get me through the week. To see your own kids starve and not be able to feed them is one of the worst pains a parent can experience. If food stamps were cut off, my 4-year-old brother and I would have to go to sleep hungry. We would also have to miss meals. This would be unfair considering he's only 4 and I'm only 15. These stories are heartbreaking and serve as evidence why cutting food stamps programs will really affect people's lives. To my colleagues, I leave you with this last one. Please don't stop helping people. Please don't stop helping people. With that, I yield back.
For purpose, the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commemorate the 4th anniversary of the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka on May 18, 2009. The last stages of the war were met with grave allegations of war crimes, including the Sri Lankan government's treatment of Tamil civilians within no-fire zones, attacks that were a blatant violation of human rights. As a result of the ensuing international outrage, Sri Lanka established a commission of inquiry to investigate the events of the 26-year civil war. However, this commission had no accountability and yielded little explanation for the families, the victims, or the international community. We're left with the task of identifying what really happened during the last years of this terrible civil war and to hold accountable those who have committed war crimes. We also face the challenge of brokering peace in a country torn apart by civil war. I urge the government of Sri Lanka to demonstrate commitment towards reconciliation and promote human rights, particularly before hosting the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in November. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, 3 years after the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, a law that is already helping millions of Americans, our friends on the other side of the aisle are wasting time again on a pointless symbolic vote that will never become law and takes us backwards. For the 37th time, our colleagues are forcing us to vote on repealing the Affordable Care Act when they know it has no chance of succeeding. For the 37th time, they're voting to allow insurance companies to deny coverage to children with pre-existing conditions. For the 37th time, they're voting to roll back our efforts to allow insurance companies to charge women more just because they're women. And for the 37th time, they're voting to strip small businesses of protections against the skyrocketing insurance premiums we face long before the ACA. Einstein used to say, insanity is when one attempts to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. This is wrong for the 37th time and a waste of our time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady's time's expired.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from California seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for a point of order.
I will state the point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I realize that H.R. 45 and its rule have not been brought up for consideration, but I wish to object to the consideration of H.R. 45 as well as consideration of the rule governing debate on the bill because it violates Rule 12, Clause 7, Section C, which states, quote, a bill or joint resolution may not be introduced unless the sponsor submits for printing in the congressional record a statement citing as specifically as practicable the power or powers granted to Congress in the Constitution to enact the bill or joint resolution, end quote. The constitutional authority statement submitted with H.R. 45 argues that Congress is granted the authority to enact this legislation because of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment does not grant Congress the authority to act. It limits congressional power. It states, quote, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, end quote. Citing the 10th Amendment does not satisfy the rule. Experts at the Congressional Research Service agree. In a recent report, they stated, quote, the 10th Amendment is not an affirmative grant of authority to Congress. Rather, it is a limitation or disability on Congress's authority to legislate. Hence, because the House rule requires a statement citing the power or powers granted to Congress, not merely a statement of constitutional provisions, citations to the 10th Amendment do not appear to satisfy the requirement of the House rule. So, Mr. Speaker, the constitutional authority statement for the bill before us today does not comply with the House rules, and I ask the bill and the rule not be considered until this problem is fixed.
The gentleman's point of order is not timely. Neither House Resolution 215 nor House Resolution 45 is pending at this time.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, the underlying bill's constitutional authority statement cites the 10th Amendment, and as such, it fails to live up to this rule of the House and tries to perpetuate the false myth that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court has heard the case. They've made their decision. The Affordable Care Act is constitutional, and Speaker Boehner has said it's the law of the land. The constitutional authority statement for this bill is completely inaccurate. It's the 37th time we're voting to repeal or defund the Affordable Care Act, but apparently we still can't get the paperwork right. How does a member correct the statement of constitutional authority?
The gentleman has not been recognized to engage in debate. Does the gentleman have a point of parliamentary inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Has the House ever voted to repeal in whole or part another piece of legislation 37 times like we're doing here today? In this case, a piece of legislation that makes it illegal for insurance companies to discriminate against a woman if she becomes pregnant and make sure that children under the age of 26 can stay on their parents' health care plan?
The Chair does not place proceedings in a historical context. It is not a proper parliamentary inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Is it correct that the House Republican budget maintained $1.2 trillion of tax increases included in the Affordable Care Act and $716 billion in cuts of Medicare, and in fact, this very budget that we operate under would not have balanced without including these savings and taxes from Obamacare?
The gentleman's point of parliamentary inquiry is not relevant to any pending business before the House.
Mr. Speaker, further parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his point of parliamentary inquiry.
Is the House here this week spending millions of dollars of taxpayer money to repeal the Affordable Care Act because it actually believes that that will occur while President Obama is in the White House, or because pressure Republicans want to score political points back home?
The Chair does not respond to points of parliamentary inquiry under the guise of a public commentary, political commentary.
I trust the American people will respond to these questions.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on the Rules, I call up House Resolution 215 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 24, House Resolution 215, resolved that upon the adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 45 to repeal the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act and health care-related provisions and the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The amendment printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill as amended and on any amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one. 2 hours of debate equally divided and controlled by the respective chairs and ranking minority members of the Committees on Education and the Workforce, Energy and Commerce, and Ways and Means, and 2, one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Mrs. Slaughter, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
House Resolution 215 provides for a rule to consider the full repeal of the flawed and ill-conceived and inappropriately named Affordable Care Act, a bill whose final language was written by staff in the Senate Finance Committee and the actual legislative text of which received not a single committee hearing or markup in this body. While many hearings and markups were held on other iterations of other health care bills, the legislation that was signed by the President received not a single moment of scrutiny in this House and contained none of the bipartisan amendments that were accepted during the markups of other health care bills, including the bill, H.R. 3200, which passed the House but was never considered by the Senate. As such, only a full repeal is acceptable, and that is what this rule provides for. The rule provides for 2 hours of debate, controlled by the Committees on Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, and Education and the Workforce. Further, the rule self-executes the Bachmann Amendment, which provides for a clean repeal of the entire ACA, consistent with the provisions of the opening day rules package of this Congress. The rule further provides the minorities one motion to recommit with or without instructions. This approach, a full repeal, will give the House, particularly members who were not here in the past 2 Congresses, an opportunity to have an up or down vote, an affirmation or denial of the Affordable Care Act. Americans should have the freedom to make their own health care decisions. In March of 2010, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was signed into law. It was drafted quickly behind closed doors at the end of 2009, behind closed doors in the other body, in fact. It included secret deals, loopholes, drafting errors, and allowed entirely new federal agencies to be created without congressional knowledge or oversight. The bottom line, it was not the way to achieve meaningful reform. In addition, the Supreme Court ruled last June, that the law is in fact a tax. This is after President Obama continually told the American people that it was not a tax. The healthcare system in America needs reform, it needs improvement, but the law that was passed will cost American taxpayers and patients millions of dollars. It will not improve care, and it will not make care more affordable. We need to start fresh and address the issues with common sense improvements that will focus on the real issues at hand, creating a healthcare system that is focused on patients instead of payment, quality instead of quantity, affordability instead of cheapness, and innovation instead of stagnation. The first step is eliminating bad legislation that simply does not work and today stands in the way of any real improvement. That is why today I strongly support the repeal of the President's health care law. The President did repeatedly tell us that the penalty associated with the individual mandate was not a tax. It was repeated several times in the run-up to this bill being signed. In June, the Supreme Court affirmed that the only way that this bill could remain law was because it is indeed a tax, and Congress has the infinite power to tax. In fact, Congress can tax morning, noon, and night. It can tax the American people back to the Stone Age if that's what it wishes, and that's what the Affordable Care Act does. When millions are unemployed, this is indeed the last thing we need. And it's not just the tax. It's the effect on premiums. Up on the Energy and Commerce website this week, a study showing how the effect of the Affordable Care Act is going to affect premiums in the individual market, the small group market, and the large group market. And almost uniformly, those premiums are going up, and in some cases they're going up a staggering amount. Last summer, the Supreme Court's decision leaves in place a costly and unworkable health care scheme that is hurting America's families. It's hurting America's workers, hurting America's job creators, and damaging America's patients. We will all have to live with that ruling. If we do not repeal, then we have to live with the law as written. The time has come to step up and do the right thing. I urge support of the rule. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon. I thank the gentleman for yielding me the customary 30 minutes and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, before I discuss the value of the Affordable Health Care Act, commonly referred to as Obamacare, I must acknowledge the sad fact that this will be the 37th time in 41 months, almost once a month, that the majority has voted to repeal or defund the law, and they know that will not happen. Recent estimates are that each vote to repeal or to defund the Affordable Care Act has cost $1.45 million in taxpayer money. So today's debate will bring the total cost of repeal votes to, wake up there, $53 million and counting. Now, while the majority wastes our tax dollars, think what we could do with $53 million. You know, the agriculture bill we were all talking about this morning is just ready to take $20 billion out of food stamps of feeding poor people. While we waste that kind of money here doing a bill month after month after month that we know is not going anywhere. But we don't have any positive agenda to put forward here. For the last 2 or 3 months, all we've done are one-house bills that everybody knows are not going to get passed, and it really is a tragedy because a CBS study said it cost $25 million a week just to run the Congress. And how deplorable that kind of waste is with all the problems we have in the country. We're told that the freshman Republicans would like once again to have an opportunity to vote to kill health care. I wonder if the freshman Republicans, as I know the freshman Democrats do, wouldn't like to vote to lift the sequester or maybe do a jobs bill, which we haven't had in 2.5 years. But we are not going to do anything either about the budget, which we heard all the time. Why doesn't the Senate do a budget? The Senate has done a budget. The Senate has asked over and over again for the House to appoint conferees so that we can get the budget put together and pass it into law. No action there either. But because of the sequester cuts, at least 70,000 children have been denied access to early education. Thousands of cancer patients have been denied their regular cancer treatments. The majority say they're holding today's vote, as I said, so the freshmen can repeal the Affordable Care Act. I wish to goodness that they would give them something that will really pass and something good to vote on. Instead of voting to repeal the sequester, the majority is voting for the 37th time to repeal a law that, and this is very important, what this law has done already, it has given 100 million Americans access to free preventive health care and measures such as mammograms and colonoscopies. That's 100 million already. They are voting for the 37th time to repeal a law that saves seniors $6.1 billion in prescription drug costs already. They are voting for the 37th time to repeal a law that has provided 3.1 million young adults with health insurance that they otherwise could not afford already. The Affordable Health Care has been particularly beneficial for America's women. Did you know that prior to the passage of this law in 8 states and the District of Columbia, domestic violence was classified as a pre-existing condition and you could be denied insurance? They were denied that because they had been abused and perhaps they would be again. Did you know that thanks to a practice called gender rating, women were charged as much as 46% more in premiums for the same level of insurance as a man? Maybe not. Maybe you didn't know that, but lots of women in the country are getting rebates for that very reason. Because of the Affordable Care Act, both of these discriminatory practices have been outlawed. In addition, the Affordable Care Act has already returned money to the pockets of millions of women thanks to the rebates required by insurance companies under the health care law. And finally, the Affordable Health Care outlawed lifetime and yearly limits, insidious insurance practices that cap the amount of health care and assurance a company would provide. But because of health care reform, Americans no longer have to worry that they will be denied health care that they need simply because insurance companies refuse to pay for their continued care. And did you know that 85% of your premium dollar will go to health care, not to other things that the insurance company wants to spend it on? Now, the majority has claimed that the Affordable Care Act is bad for America's small businesses. The truth is that any small business that has less than 50 employees requires them to do nothing different, nothing at all, than what they're doing today. But a small business with less than 25 employees are eligible for a tax credit of 35% right now. And on January 1st, that tax credit will increase to 50%. You will get a tax credit on half of the health insurance you pay to your under 25% employees. 25 employees, excuse me. Now, the majority has also claimed and will continue to claim that the Affordable Health Care was passed in the dark of night through closed-door processes that denied their side of the aisle the opportunity to participate in the legislative process. This charge is categorically untrue. The Affordable Health Care Act was the product of nearly 100 hearings, 83 hours of committee markups, including both Republicans and Democrats making amendments. The House heard from 181 witnesses, both Democrat and Republican. 239 amendments were considered in House committees and 121 were adopted. And while some on the other side of the aisle have charged that the final version of the law was rushed through the House, the final bill was available for 72 hours before any members were asked to vote on it. In contrast, the Patients' Rights to Repeal Act, which we are doing again today, I said for the 37th time, is being considered after no committee hearings, no committee markups, and under a closed rule. That means there will be no amendments on this bill. Even if one were sympathetic toward the majority's goal, the complete abuse of the legislative process should give every member of this chamber pause. Mr. Speaker, today's vote is just the latest in the majority's all-out effort to undermine the process of implementing the health law. Their efforts have taken many forms, but central to it all is their refusal to provide the necessary funding to fully implement the law, and a gleeful willingness to criticize an implementation process that is underfunded and undermined at every single turn. But despite their best efforts, I believe that in years to come the majority will find they stood on the wrong side of history, just as they stood on the wrong side of history when Social Security was passed and when Medicare came into being. Indeed, the opponents of the Affordable Care Act have already had their day in court. Last summer, the Supreme Court affirmed the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, putting to rest any false legal concerns that opponents had. And while the constitutionality of the law is no longer a question, one might expect opponents to criticize the law's impact on our nation's finances. But here again, the facts will stand in the way. Over the last 3 years, U.S. health care spending grew at 3.9%. That, Mr. Speaker, 3.9% is the lowest growth rate in 50 years. And according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, repealing the Affordable Care Act would actually increase our nation's deficit by more than $100 billion over the next 10 years. Please think of that and understand what they are trying to do away with today, the things that help you. Mr. Speaker, providing safe, secure, and affordable health care for our citizens has been the goal of both Republican and Democrat lawmakers for generations. As far back as Theodore Roosevelt, we acknowledge the need to provide our citizens with a health care system that puts their health before industry profits, that has good outcome as other parts of the world provide for their citizens. And we need to treat health care as a right, not a privilege, for the lucky few. Now, under the leadership of Democrat Congress, we managed to realize, at long last, this long-awaited goal by passing the Affordable Care Act through an open, deliberative, thorough legislative process. And from reducing our nation's health care spending to expanding the health care to millions of Americans who could not afford it, the affordable health care is succeeding. It is in this light that the majority's 37th vote in 41 months to repeal health care should be judged. And it's hard to judge their politically driven vote as anything other than a disservice to the American people, a waste of taxpayer money, and a way to spread misinformation. I urge my colleagues to reject today's rule and the underlying legislation, and I reaffirm my pride in supporting a law that is already helping to save lives and already providing American people with secure and affordable health care. And after it is fully implemented next year, all Americans will benefit, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, now I would like to reserve 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, member of the Budget Committee, Roger Williams.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of freedom and free enterprise, the hallmarks of our great American democracy. A government that places high value on these principles does not force its citizens to hand over their hard-earned money for a mandatory product, in this case, health insurance. This is not just how it's done in America. Mr. Speaker, Nancy